old suit of armor. All the pieces are wired together. Those eyes almost look real.
Today on Ancient DOS Games, we're taking a look at Realms of the Haunting, a name invoking horror and spookiness, and this game isn't any of that. In fact, I'm pretty sure the developers never intended for the name itself to invoke fear or to lead to presumptions of horror tropes, because once you play this thing, you realize the name is actually quite literal. Realms is in reference to the sheer number of different realms you visit across the dimensional planes, and Haunting refers to the fact that many of the entities you encounter are deceased, non-corporeal, damned, or any combination of those, and you're thus encountering and interacting with the essence of what they are or were. But anyways, I actually already had a bit of an idea of what I was getting myself into, as even though I'd never played this game before, Ross Scott of Ross's Game Dungeon has, and has done an excellent and in-depth video on this game, mostly focusing on the story, which I'm encouraging you all to watch following this video, as I'm going to be focusing on the technical aspects and the gameplay, as I usually do. And as far as gameplay goes, this game is curious, to say the least. What we have here is an attempt to hybridize a first-person shooter with an inventory-based adventure, and the weird thing is it kinda works and it kinda doesn't. The closest comparison I can make in terms of gameplay is System Shock, but that's being awfully generous because System Shock wasn't nearly as clunky as this game is. True, System Shock could be a bit overwhelming at times, but it offered a lot more freedom of movement and was better streamlined. Although Realms of the Haunting does offer some of its own unique takes on streamlining, which does help to some extent. Should also quickly point out that for as much as I'm about to rip into the game's mechanics and a particular failing of the game as a whole later on, the graphics on offer here are incredibly detailed. This is a game which could seriously benefit from a remastering to fix its quirks, give it true color, hardware accelerated graphics, and just make it much more playable overall. Though given the heavy reliance on FMVs to tell the story, might not be that simple.
Hell, you won't get me sat on that again.
Realms of the Haunting was developed by Gremlin Interactive and published through Interplay in 1997 and as a one-player first-person shooter/adventure hybrid. I hesitate to call it a flat-out first-person adventure, as those different aspects really don't mesh together very well, as you often find yourself engaging in lots of shooting or lots of puzzle solving, and almost never both at the same time. Now, it supports multiple VGA and SVGA graphics modes running at 256 colors, from as low as 320 by 200 to as high as 640 by 480. Now, I'm pretty sure the game was primarily designed to run at 640 by 400, but the text is very small, and because I had to capture the footage externally from DOSBox, had I run it that way, it would have made the text very hard for all of you to read on screen right now. So I opted instead to run it at 640 by 480, which gives the 3D aspect some more pixels to work with, but it does squish all of the pre-rendered FMVs and some of the visuals a bit. As for audio, it supports a decent array of sound and music devices, and as for its current release date, the game's still commercial but very easy to acquire nowadays. You can get it digitally from either Steam or GOG, with it being considerably cheaper on Steam for some reason, often going on sale for literally just a single dollar. Or if you prefer a physical copy, there's tons of them out there. Well, at least loose, with a typical loose copy of all 4 CDs in its jewel case selling for around $10. Now, fully boxed and sealed copies are a bit less common, but they're not impossible to find, though for some reason the prices for them are a bit scattered. A lot of sellers try to get as much as $65 for a sealed copy, but sold listings indicate most fully boxed copies, including sealed, tend to go for between $20 and $40. So given how common this game is, it's best to be patient and wait for a good price if you want a fully boxed or sealed copy.
Adam, please don't turn away from me. I need your help.
The story to this game is very cryptic. In fact, it's intentionally designed to be overly cryptic so as to allow the viewer interpretation to some extent, especially given the subject matter. And I mean, some people are good with that and some people aren't, but I wanted to mention that right away because that might be a deciding factor as to if you want to try this game out yourself or not. As for how the game begins, you play the role of a man by the name of Adam Randall, who was estranged from his father many years ago as his father became more and more interested in helping others and following religious teachings rather than raising him. However, one day, a very sly and suspicious man arrives at Adam's door to deliver a package to him, supposedly from his father. Now, at first, Adam doesn't open it, but then Adam starts to experience these weird dreams and ultimately decides to look inside, discovering a number of small, ornate fragments of disc-shaped objects. Now, Adam has no idea what they are or what the symbols on them mean, but he feels a sort of power resonating from them and decides he needs to find out what's going on. Thus, the game opens up with Adam taking a taxi to an old mansion where his father was last seen. Adam goes inside, and just as he begins to explore, the doors slam shut behind him, trapping him within. By this point, the game begins proper, but I should point out that this thing's absolutely chock full of lore, though it's not immediately obvious that it is, as much of it's buried within the inventory system. Well, I'll go over this more in a bit, but another thing I need to point out too is that the game is technically divided into chapters, 20 in all, and every time you clear a major objective, the chapter advances. However, the chapter mechanic is otherwise just a sort of guide as to how deep you are into everything, and nothing more. Despite being able to explore the mansion to whatever extent you have access to, the story is entirely linear, thus you have to progress through it in the way that was intended. I mean, short of finding glitches or something.
The power of the stars is great, but delicate. Use it well.
So as we've already established, Realms of the Haunting is a sort of hybrid between an inventory-based adventure and a first-person shooter. In fact, the engine being used here is an offshoot of the engine Gremlin Interactive used for one of their prior games, Normality, which itself is a hybrid between a 2.5D engine and a 3D polygonal engine, as the level structures themselves are composed of a 2D map with sectors defining walls, ceiling heights, and floor heights, but the engine also allows for 3-dimensional polygonal objects, which in this case is primarily used for doors, boxes, tables, or pretty much anything that doesn't need extreme amounts of detail. Thus, things like suits of armor, telescopes, even the enemies, are all done with 2D sprites. One of the main things you need to keep an eye on is your mouse cursor. And this cursor's been designed to light up in clever ways in order for the player to understand how to interact with the world around them. The cursor has 2 lights on it, one for the left mouse button and one for the right mouse button. The left mouse button light turns green when there's an object you can interact with or pick up and add to your inventory. It lights up blue if it could light up green, but you're too far away, and it lights up red if what you're pointing at can be attacked with a weapon. The right mouse button light only lights up white, and when it does so, clicking the right mouse button lets you examine whatever it is that you're pointing at. Just like in System Shock, the mouse also acts to aim your weapons. You can have 2 items equipped at all times, one in your left hand and one in your right hand. Whatever's in your left hand is considered your weapon to attack with, while whatever's in your right hand is an item you can use on something in the world. Now when you click on an enemy to attack, your attack is aimed towards the enemy. However, the light on the cursor must be red for a weapon to be used, otherwise nothing happens. Now if you want to attack without a clear line of sight towards a target, you simply press the control key on the keyboard, but this always attacks straight ahead, so it can be tricky to aim given the controls, which I'm not going to talk about them just yet. Instead, let's focus on item usage because I think this is actually kind of ingenious. One of the things which is always a bother with inventory-based adventures is being faced with an obtuse puzzle and not really knowing what the solution is. Thus you resort to trying everything on everything. Well, while Realms of the Haunting can certainly be set up that way, by default, it's set to easy mode. In this mode, if you try to click on something in the world which requires you to use a specific item, one of 3 things will happen. If you get a message saying that you can't really do anything, it means you lack the object necessary in your inventory. If you see the symbol in the bottom right corner of the screen change, it means you have the right item, but it wasn't equipped in your right hand, so it just got equipped. If you already had the right item in your right hand, or it just got placed there, clicking will now use the object as intended on the thing in the world which requires it. This method of object interactivity greatly simplifies the whole process and completely eliminates the necessity to do the whole try everything approach when you get stuck, as you'll know in a heartbeat if you have the right item or not. However, it does get a little more complicated than that when you open your inventory itself. The inventory is split into 5 sections, which from left to right are general items, weapons and ammunition, magical items, books and papers, and then an information section. Now inside the inventory, the left mouse button now acts to pick up and put down items so that you can rearrange them or place them into your hands manually, as might be appropriate under certain conditions. The right mouse button still looks at objects, but will now bring up a close-up view with a pre-rendered visual of the object, sometimes with additional musings, but also sometimes with a conversation button. The conversation button allows Adam to think about certain things and muse on them, but later in the game you get a partner who follows you around discreetly by the name of Rebecca Trevisard, and she brings a whole new level to the amount of lore you bring up from your inventory items, especially in the information sections. Seriously, there's more lore to be found with her insights than nearly anyone else in the game is willing to directly tell you. Save for a particular person much later on who's basically expositioned the character, with the sheer quantity of dialogue that he has.
What place? Please keep talking.
However, one thing which is not immediately obvious is how to both use items on yourself and how to combine items together. Now, the way this works is that in order to use an item in this manner, you have to have it picked up on your mouse cursor within your inventory, at which point you need to press the U key on the keyboard while hovering the item over itself to indicate that you want to use it on yourself, or over another item to indicate that you want to use it on that item to try and combine the two. I should point out though, combining items is a mechanic that's almost never used in this game, but it should be fairly obvious when you need to do it given the linear nature of the story. One other important thing to note about the inventory is the slots in the weapons section. The 1 through 6 keys on the keyboard act as weapon hotkeys, but because of the sheer number of weapons in the game, they're not assigned to specific weapons, save for the 1 key which is assigned to unarmed punching. The 2 through 6 keys automatically arm the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, or 5th weapons appearing in your inventory. So a good practice is to sort your weapons around so that the top 5 slots of your weapon inventory represent the 5 weapons you want to have assigned to your hotkeys. Ammunition's also handled automatically, as if you try to fire a weapon that needs to reload, it'll reload in that moment. Though you're going to discover fairly quickly that most weapons don't actually need ammo.
That is one of my most treasured possessions.
I'll look after it for you. Do we need it for something special?
It is both a dedicated weapon and a key.
You get a number of magical weapons throughout the course of the game, and there's 3 main mechanics that these follow. The first magical weapon you get is a staff, which can charge up to 6 attack points at a time. The higher the charge, the more damage the weapon does, keeping in mind that all enemies in the game have different levels of resistance to different weapons, at least as far as I can tell, and that higher levels of charge seem to do significantly higher amounts of damage. Another magical weapon you get early on has a large number of charges and is extremely powerful, but never recharges. I mean, if there is a way to recharge it, I couldn't figure it out, so it's best saved for a really bad situation. The other kind of magical weapon is one which can only hold a single charge at a time, and once fired, needs to recharge fully before it can fire again. As you get more and more magical weapons, all of which recharge whether they're armed or not, you're going to enter this pattern where you deal with enemies by firing off charges in each of your magical weapons, and then switch to your conventional weapons while waiting for those to recharge. Despite having limited ammo for the basic guns, you find this ammo freaking everywhere, so it's actually pretty difficult to run out, despite the fact that some areas have infinitely respawning enemies, and some enemies can soak up massive amounts of shots before going down, which would normally be a bad thing, except, well, the AI in this game is actually really dumb. The AI typically will not go through most doors, and if it thinks it's stuck, it'll start to run in a big circle to get unstuck, and many early enemies don't even shoot back, and the later enemies which do shoot back don't shoot back often. You do have to be careful about being trapped or pincered though. Anytime you hear or see enemies spawn in, it's important to immediately look behind you, as there's a very good chance they spawn behind you as well. So long as you keep that in mind, battles tend to be very easy. At least, once you've dealt with the one major failing of this otherwise surprisingly decent game. Wow, it has been quite a while since I've run into a control scheme this bad. You know what that means? Yeah, you do. Time to break out the ADG pixel art keyboard. Yeah, I don't mind the cobwebs. I know it's been years since I put this thing in a video. But yeah, the default controls in this game are borderline unusable. And without applying a patch that I didn't know existed until after I was done playing this thing, you cannot redefine them. Now, before I show you all what these controls are, do keep in mind, this game was released in 1997. By this point in time, games like Duke Nukem 3D and Quake had already established a baseline for how to do controls relatively well, and even System Shock, despite having overcomplicated controls, still kept them within a single hand's reach and organized them in an easy to remember manner. So, first off, you use the arrow keys to move forward and backward and to turn left and right. Pretty standard. Comma and period are your strafing controls. Again, this is technically standard, but most games which use those as the defaults allowed you to change them, and virtually everyone using a mouse to turn did. But you cannot turn with the mouse in this game. I mean, you technically can by holding the right mouse button down, but it's done with accelerative motion. It's extraordinarily difficult to get a handle on, so I do not recommend doing it that way. Plus again, you have to hold the right mouse button down, which overrides certain other things that you would normally want to do. So it's not a perfect solution either way. Now you might think, okay, so you just keep two hands on the keyboard then, unless you need to click on something, right? I mean, that sounds right, but then why is jump on the A key and crouch on the Z key? Well, we suddenly need 3 hands to do this. And remember, you use the 1 through 6 keys as your weapon hotkeys. One way or another, 2 hands is not enough to handle all of this. Now, the I key is your inventory key, because of course, and you can run in this game, but there's no dedicated run button. To run, you have to turn caps lock on, which then rapidly cycles run mode on and off. Now, admittedly, that might be an emulation thing, as I have no good means to test that on real hardware at the moment. But yeah, to turn run mode on, you have to tap caps lock twice so that it doesn't start cycling like crazy, then tap it twice again to turn it off when you're done running. And then despite all of this, we still need a means to look up and down. Well, how about 2 means to look up and down? Yeah, pressing home or end will cause you to slowly look up or down, but if you want to look up or down to the maximum extent possible very quickly, you can use the page up or page down keys. However, these keys need to be held down, otherwise when you let go, they reset your view to be centered. So we effectively have 2 view centering keys, as actually holding either of these keys down while trying to position yourself correctly to make use of the viewing angle is incredibly cumbersome. And believe it or not, we're not quite done with this yet. Either control key can be used to fire your selected weapon straight ahead. The spacebar is used only to load the most recently saved game and only works when you're dead. While the gamma correction keys are placed on C and V for some bizarre reason, and any changes you make to the gamma correction setting are not remembered between play sessions, nor are changes reported with text. So you have to memorize how many times you hit the gamma correction keys to bring it up to where you want it to be every time you boot the game. Yeah, is it any wonder that a patch exists for the sole purpose of making it possible to reconfigure this mess? Again, I had no idea the patch was even a thing, and I had to resort to tinkering with DOSBox's keymapper to make this playable. I ultimately put all the strafing, movement, and turning controls over on the QWE ASD keys, as I don't mind strafing and turning at the same time with the keyboard. I moved to jump to X, and moved the slow look controls over to R and F. Though I kept the fast look controls on page up and page down, as there weren't going to be many circumstances where I'd need to hit those quickly, and I didn't want to mess with the key mappings more than I had to, just in case. Overall, Realms of the Haunting is interesting, and a curious exception to one of my general rules when it comes to recommending games. And see, for me personally, I don't really care too much about the graphics. Like, there's a small handful of things I don't like to visually see, mostly in regards to mixing cute and cuddly stuff with massive amounts of violence and gore. But beyond that, the graphics are not my main focus with the game. It's aspects like the story and the gameplay which I feel define a game best. But Realms of the Haunting is perhaps the first game I've ever played in my entire life where my recommending this game or not cannot depend on those factors. So here's the thing. This game's story is definitely going to rub some people the wrong way, while other people won't be able to get enough of it. The story is very ambiguous and leaves a lot of open ends to things, but at the same time is chock full of lore and references, again primarily to occult and semi-religious things. But there's lots of other references to other cultures as well, many of which are pulled from reality to some extent. So if you're into those kinds of things, or simply in a position where you want to learn bits and pieces about them, then this game provides tons of lore on that front. In terms of the gameplay, it's ultimately clunky and weak, and if this were nearly any other game, this would render it nearly unplayable. But the streamlining of being able to have items automatically selected, coupled with the extremely poor AI for the enemies, makes it surprisingly easy to survive and make progress despite the clunkiness. Though you do have to save frequently and keep multiple saves, because it is actually possible to enter unwinnable states, though they're fortunately very few and very sudden. So you shouldn't have to back up more than a single save state if you run into one of these. So where does that all leave us? Again, to the lore and graphics, which means unlike every other time I recommend a game or not, this is the one and only exception where the gameplay doesn't matter and the story doesn't matter. If you like the visuals or like the kind of lore being used to give this game its identity, then that's what should be your deciding factor as to whether to try this game out or not. For everyone else, there's nothing here for you. But if you want the whole experience spoiled just for the heck of it, along with some different takes on the mechanics and progression, absolutely check out Ross's video. Amazingly, this game's really easy to set up in DOSBox despite being a late DOS title. Just leave cycle set to auto and you should be good. Now, my copy came from GOG, so I don't know if the physical release has any copy protection on the CDs or not, which would get in the way. However, the GOG release does not include ISOs of the CDs at all, instead combining all 4 CDs into a single folder and manually setting the data path to the point to that folder. So you might be able to get away with that yourself when setting up a physical copy to run in DOSBox, which would certainly save on a lot of disk swapping and loading times if possible. That said, this was an early GOG title and isn't quite configured properly, as many early GOG releases had configuration issues. So if you do get this game on GOG, you either need to manually set the DOSBox configuration to use IRQ5 for Sound Blaster support instead of IRQ7, or copy the readme.txt file from the data path to the install path for the game so that the install program will run properly and allow you to change the configuration. Yes, seriously, the install program checks for the presence of a readme.txt file and refuses to start up if it's missing. No idea whose bright idea that was. And that is all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. As with every year, I always take the last 2 months off from ADG to rest and recharge, as well as to put effort into other projects. But before I sign off from ADG duties until 2021, there'll be a filler next Saturday, just to go over what to expect for the next couple months and for next year. And I actually have one more filler planned following in November, which I wasn't originally going to do, but circumstances have kind of worked out in a weird way, so it's better that I do said filler sooner rather than later. So make sure to stay tuned to see the filler next Saturday, and the filler following in November. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small set of you guys.